Hello, this is Pastor Marleen Griffith-Stull. I'm coming to you with the end of our study on 2 Timothy. So this is chapter 4 of 2 Timothy. And once again, I encourage you to read it either before you listen to this or after you listen to this, but definitely read the text. Don't just listen to what I have to say about it, because there's a lot of other things in there that I hope that you read and ponder as you struggle with the Word of God. But it starts off with a sense that it's very urgent, what Paul has to say to Timothy. Now, of course, there are many people who would argue Paul doesn't write this letter. I've said that before. I'm more of the opinion that it's much more likely that Paul wrote 2 Timothy than 1 Timothy because of some of the pieces in it. So I think it's a good possibility that Paul did pen this. But in the end, I think what's important is that somebody of faith wrote this and made sure that it carried Paul's message. And it is definitely kind of Paul's last will and testament, Paul's attempt to get across what's really most urgent and most important in ministry. And addressed to Timothy, this young leader. He's not quite so young anymore, but still is still very active in ministry. But this urgency of making sure that you share God's word, and whether the time is favorable or not. Don't wait until there's a good time. Don't wait until it's a perfect opportunity to share the love of Christ. Do it always. And that's what you get at this point, because you don't know when you'll have another opportunity. So you have this whole reminder to do that, and also a reminder that there will be a time when people will not long for the truth. They will just want to hear what they want to hear. And I would say, because this is written a long time ago, there have been many instances, and you could point to them historically, when people have really had itching ears and they don't want to hear the truth. They just want to hear what they want to hear. Some people would argue we're in a moment like that right now. And probably historically, you're always in a moment like that, or at least there's groups always in a moment like that. But the reminder is to be steadfast in our faith and in our message, even if people don't want to hear what we have to say. And then we move into verses 6 through 8. And that's really where we get this sense of urgency from Paul and his images of being poured out of his a libation. This is like a liquid sacrifice that might have been made to the gods of the time. That would have been the image. But realizing that he's already being sacrificed, that his departure, his death is drawing very imminent, as he writes. And realizing, too, that his fight is over. He's fought the good fight. He's run the race. Images that you've heard in other Pauline texts in the past. But now he has kept the faith. And that's a reminder for all of us as we continue in our faith to be steadfast in our faith despite what persecutions and trials might come our way. And then there's this image of being reserved the crown of righteousness. Sometimes this gets taken very literally. I mean, there's whole groups that will talk about receiving a crown. I remember a friend in high school had this image from one of her pastor's sermons about receiving this crown when you come before the throne of Christ in the resurrection. I don't read it quite so literally, but Paul's definitely talking about something imperishable, something that's lasting forever. And I would say it's that final justification, that time of really being made right in God's eyes because of Christ our Lord. And then we get into kind of very personal things in the end. Really from 9 through verse 18 it is. And some of these things, you read them and you think, okay, what do these people have to do with anything? Why do we want to worry about who these names are? Or you're the other type of person who looks at these things and is like curious, like, who's this person? Who's that person? What do we know about them? How does this connect to Paul's ministry? And the reality is there's some of them that we can connect and some of them that we know a lot about. And So I'm going to share some of the things that we know, and some of them we just simply don't know anything else about. It's just somebody that Paul is writing about. But the beginning of it is, come to me as soon as you can, because I've been deserted, which is not a good thing ever. But Demas apparently was a firm supporter of Paul and is no longer in support of him. The likelihood is that during times of persecution, this man just ran away. He was frightened and ran off, did not want to continue following and possibly facing the persecutions that Paul himself was facing. But it's an urgency to make sure that Timothy gets there in time. But he's deserted him. And then there's some other people that we're not really sure that they deserted him or if they just went off to do ministry elsewhere. It's a little vague. Crescens to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. And is this on Paul's urging that this is places where people need to go, or are they just trying to avoid some of the persecution and some of the trials and tribulations that Paul himself is facing? We don't know. But in the end, apparently only Luke is with him. Luke is the one who's identified, obviously, as the author of Luke, but Luke and Acts. And part of the reason why he gets identified as that author, we know that it's somebody that's with Paul. There's the we passages in the book of Acts, and it's dedicated, both Luke and Acts are dedicated to the same person. So nobody really argues that there's two different authors. Scholars are pretty much, I'm sure there's somebody that argues it, but, pretty much everybody agrees that Luke and Acts are by the same person. It's kind of a continuation of the gospel. The Acts is kind of a continuation after the gospel, according to Luke. But part of the reason why Luke gets named as the writer, because of course the writers never say who they are in the Gospels, is that Luke's somebody that's with Paul at the very end. And there's certainly many passages in Acts that talk about Luke being present. But Luke is there with him, and Timothy is urged to bring Mark as well. And it's really interesting to bring Mark because there had been quite some conflict with Mark in the past. Barnabas had kind of sided with Mark, or at least still thought Mark was useful for ministry. And so Barnabas and Mark kind of go off by themselves in Acts 13 and part ways with Paul at that time. So there's much dissension, but obviously now Paul and Mark have reconciled. And we also hear that they had reconciled in Colossians and Philemon, verse 24. So, there's it's a reminder that even when we have disagreements about how ministry should be, and we have disagreements about the mission of God and how it is that we should live out our faith and be the faithful people of God, there is always hope for reconciliation. And I think the story of Paul and Mark is a great one to look at that, because we do argue about things, some of them very important issues, some of the minor issues, but in the end, it's Mark's one of the people that Paul wants to be with him, which is a very firm, dramatic thing to say. And so it would be those three. It would be Luke, Mark, and Timothy. And there's this urgency to be there face to face, to spend some time together. And I think I always valued that, but after COVID, I value it so much more. And I think probably most of you listening value those in-person things so much more than we used to. And when you think about in Paul's time, it would have been simply letters that would have been written. They couldn't make phone calls. They weren't texting one another. They certainly weren't Zooming with one another. So this is a really fervent thing to try to get together in person one more time. And then we have a couple others. Obviously, Tychonitis, Tychicus, I'm butchering his name too. Paul's actually sent to Ephesus. And that's because he plans on Timothy leaving to come to him. So somebody will be there. But then there's also, some practical things that Paul wants to make sure is there for this meeting and for himself. One, a cloak, because winter is coming and he needs this heavy coat. So that's just a personal thing. But the books and above all the parchments, all these writings, there's a lot of conjecture on what the writings are. I mean, are these Paul's own letters that he wants to make sure get compiled? Certainly, his letters are saved and preserved better than any other letters in all of early Christianity. So maybe that's exactly how it comes to pass, is that these three, Timothy's told, get everything together and make sure it comes so that it is preserved and it is passed on. Or are these other early Christian writings? Because when you listen to the book of Luke, you hear that there's he wants to write an orderly account, which means that he has other sources. And so there are sources probably of sayings of Jesus early on. I'm sure there's other letters from other Christian leaders. And there certainly would have been maybe sermons or other things that have been written down. So whether it's Paul's own writing or other people's writing or just kind of those collections of all those things, but Paul wants to make sure they're there, and in part for him to study and be nourished in this word and strengthened, but maybe also to make sure that these key leaders have this when his time comes and he's no longer there, to make sure that they have these things in place. Who knows? One commentator actually made the case that, since we've named Luke and Mark as gospel writers, maybe in fact Paul was the one who encouraged them to write the Gospels. It does imply that they got there in time A and that Paul actually wrote the letter, but it is a possibility that Paul may have been the one encouraging them to write down Jesus' life. And of course, we don't know who actually pens Mark and Luke, but the biblical tradition was that these people who had been ministers with Paul are the ones that write down these Gospels. So could be. It was just one of those conjectures that maybe they're bringing their own writings, or at least the pieces of the writings that need to come. But either way, it's important to have these early Christian documents there so that as they talk, as they plan, and I believe Paul wants to make plans for the church before he dies and wants to make sure that things are carried out. The other thing that he tells him that's a very personal thing is to beware of this Alexander, who we heard about earlier in the letter. He has apparently done great harm. Whether he's the one who got Paul arrested, we don't know, but we know he's somebody that you want to avoid as an early Christian, and that's about all we know. But it obviously is somebody that Timothy knows, because he doesn't have to give him any more explanation. He just says, hey, beware of Alexander. So obviously that makes sense to him. And then the second, in my Bible, it's the second paragraph of this section, 16 to 18, really talks about losing support during his first offense, Paul losing support. Some commentators have said often there would be like kind of an initial defense, kind of like our preliminary hearing type of thing, and then later on a more thorough defense. So this could all be the same first arrest. There's also the theory that Paul is released from Rome. It has some time out, and this is actually a second arrest in Rome. So I don't know, is this first defense, what time frame that is. But he's obviously lost a lot of support, even early on when he's making the defense. By the time he's arrested in Rome, Paul is losing support, and that's what's important. But Christ stood by him, and there's that image of being rescued from the lion's mouth. That's an image in the Old Testament as well, of being rescued right from the lion's mouth. Obviously, Paul doesn't expect himself to literally be rescued. He expects to die, but it's that spiritual rescue, that final rescue. because he said this is the end for him. So he's not thinking that it's going to be a miraculous rescue at the last moment. The next section is really greetings and the benediction. Now, one reason why I would say this is more likely to be Paul's writing than 1 Timothy is all the greetings and greetings of people that we know Paul shared ministry with. And we don't know about all of them, but we know some things about quite a few of them. We know that Priscilla and Aquila, mentioned in verse 19, that they did ministry. They were also tent makers. They did ministry with Paul. And interesting enough, Priscilla or Prisca is almost always listed first, even though she's the female, which usually makes her inferior. So she's really the leader in this husband and wife team. And they did have a household church, and Paul had just a lot of respect for their ministry. Acts 18 has a lot about their ministry together, and there's also some things, some references on Romans, but Acts 18 would be kind of their story if you wanted to read through that. The household of Onesiphorus or Erastus, we don't know much about, but we know something from Acts 19, a little bit about them. And Trophimus, we know went with Paul on his third journey. In Acts 21, it talks about Trophimus. Trophimus. I'm probably definitely mispronouncing that one. But we do know a little bit about him, at least, from Paul's writing. And then Paul says, hey, come before winter. Now, the reason to come before winter is the urgency and the cloak. Hey, you're bringing me a heavy coat, get here before winter. But also the practicality. If you're going to sail at that time, and of course, to get from Ephesus over to Rome, the best way is through the Mediterranean. And really, you need to do that before winter comes, because most sailors don't even try to cross in the winter. It's very, very dangerous. So you want to try to get out before winter. And this is a 3 to 4 month voyage. So if you're coming before winter, you need to hightail it out of there before the end of summer, really, to make it work. And we don't, of course, know what ultimately happens, whether or not Timothy is able to get Mark and get there. But it is an interesting thing to remember. Don't really know anything about Eubulus, or Pudens, but Linus, and Claudia mentioned also some historical text, but Linus is mentioned, or there is a Linus, if it's not the same Linus, is mentioned by Irenaeus and Eusebius. They're both early church fathers, but Linus is mentioned as a bishop of Rome. Actually, he's referred to as the second bishop of Rome. We always put Peter as the bishop of Rome. This is really the person who follows after Peter has been martyred. So he reigns, historically about 12 years. So if Paul is writing this in Linus's lifetime, it really is, a greeting to him and to encourage him. If it's written much later, as some scholars debate, then it's not so much that. It really is maybe more of a remembrance of Linus. But, it was interesting to me to know who Linus was, because I thought he was just a Peanuts character. Didn't really know much about him. So knowing that he was the second bishop of Rome is an important thing. And then the very end is just the benediction. But Paul's letters always end with a benediction. And it's important to note that the you in the benediction is plural, reminding us that this letter is not just written to Timothy, but written to you as well. So I'm going to close just with those words of benediction. The Lord be with your spirit. Grace be with you. Thanks.